welcome back to Psychedelics. Today with Adam, founder and CEO of Flow State Micro. But really fun story past, Adam. Really excited to get into it with you. So where do we want to start? We were just kind of chatting about your origin story and how you got to California. So maybe that's worth it. I think that's probably a fun way to go. So you started out in Michigan, and what happened? Or what was the impulse?
I grew up in Michigan. I went to college in Utah. I majored in snow maintenance or powder snowboarding and somehow walked away with a degree. Went back to Michigan, and then about 13 years ago, I got in a VW bus named Stella Blue, and I drove it to California to work in the cannabis industry. The bus broke down in Grass Valley, where I still live today. I began to work on farms that season. Within 2-3 years, I had my own farm and was working as a sun-grown organic farmer. I worked under Prop 215, eventually got 2 licenses, distribution, manufacturing, which I sold about 3 years ago to pivot into mushrooms. So I did spend about a decade growing and farming cannabis before moving into mushrooms.
Amazing. That's really cool. And what kind of cannabis stuff were you doing? Was there a certain kind of focus?
Yeah, my focus was sun-grown organic, know your farmer, know your medicine, know your soil, was very big into growing from seed, compost, organic amendments, all of that stuff. And I was really
from seed super rare. The rest of it is like pretty awesome, but like that's fascinating that you were going from seed.
It's fascinating. We have a fascinating microclimate here in the Sierra Nevada mountains where with seeds, you can put them outside, March 15th to March 20th, once that spring equinox happens. And because they're seed plants, it gets a little lighter every day and they won't go into flower. So with the seed plants, we would get a huge advantage, maybe an extra 2-3 months of veg on the clone plants.
That's super cool. Wow. And were you involved in any kind of like bigger industry plays that you want to talk about, like interactions with some of the bigger multi-state operators or wealthy folks jumping in?
Yeah, I mean that could be a whole podcast. I thought the black market and the gray market was really corrupt, and then I got into the legal market, and I met the real corrupt individuals, and I had to teach myself how to walk through regulation. I learned about shady lawyers, shady consultants, shady landlords, shady business partners. I mean, the long and short of it is Prop 64 was a huge failure here in California. It drove the small farmer out of business. It drove prices, even on the black market, ridiculously low. So Prop 64 was a huge fail. I work with celebrities. I'm not going to name the celebrities, but a lot of these celebrities are as big of a joke as the huge conglomerates that come in and consolidate the space and take it away from the OGs or the legacy farmers that have been doing it in Mendocino for 30, 40 years. So yeah, I could do a whole podcast on what to look out for in the legal cannabis space, the corruption, the regulation, and then how we want to make sure that does not happen in the psychedelic space.
Well, since we don't want to spend the whole time on it, can you give us just a brief high level on what your thoughts are there?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we can do a whole bigger one later, but we want to focus on microdosing today.
The way I break it down is they created huge hurdles and all kinds of regulations, which came down to dollars, and you had to spend excessive amounts of money to jump through the dollars and the hoops to get your license. And then once you get a license, it doesn't guarantee that you ever get your product on a shelf, right? And that's what people don't realize is
you'd get a license from the state, but you'd have to negotiate with retail operators to be able to put it on a shelf. And
the single biggest problem for manufacturers, distributors, and farmers in California is that there's 300 retail locations and there's 3,000 plus licenses and brands and manufacturers. So 3,000 companies can't fit on only 300 store shelves.
Why are there only 300? That's crazy. So it's 300 total retail licenses. So there's or is it actual locations?
It's actual licensed dispensaries, and now I would bet it's upwards of closer to 400. It's more than 300, but basically a lot of the problem lies on just shelf space. People can't get their products onto the shelf. There's a lot of payola that goes on, which is what was happening in the record industry back in the day, where you have to slip somebody $5,000-$10,000 under the table for them even consider putting your product on the shelf. So right now in legal cannabis, the only people that survive are the big groups that can afford to lose $1 million in burning cash a month, and watching all the small people fall out, and then they consolidate. So it's a very tricky space. That's not to say people aren't being successful, but the original people that taught me 13, 14 years ago and have been here 30, 40 years, they didn't get a seat at the table, and they're not a part of the space.
Right on. So we might see something similar in psychedelics, or you feel like it's likely. And yeah, I wonder how Oregon will play out.
Let's put it to you this way, Joe. We ran into each other at Meetdelic, the conference in Las Vegas, and I saw these same investors and lawyers and consultants that I saw around the cannabis conferences about 4 or 5 years ago. And they're all pivoting into this space. They're sharks. There's a lot of sharks out there. So we do need to be extra careful. And this does not need to go the way of cannabis in any way, shape, or form. It needs to be done completely different. We can start by just decriminalizing it, and starting there before we even worry about how we monetize or legalize it.
I love the impulse. Where I get hung up, and we can move on to microdosing after that, is like decrim's an excellent first next step, but I'm always like curious about, because I'm not just curious in psychedelics. My whole thing is like full total drug policy reform, because the drug war is so disgusting. But like, and then next step, how do we handle safe supply even on like kind of non-plant psychedelics?
Well, as a father, I'm a single dad to 2 kids, and both of those kids at periods of time in their life were raised on a cannabis farm. And what I'll tell you is this: when you normalize these plants and these tools, and it's just like a flower or a squash that my kid sees farmed like the farmer next to me, my kids want nothing to do with cannabis. It is so uncool. It's the last thing they want to be around. I don't have any worries about my son or daughter smoking pot. And why? Because we normalized it. And if you look at Portugal and what they've done with drugs and the success they've had with, decrim legalization, supporting substance abuse issues with, therapists and programs. I mean, this is the future. This is the answer. And I've seen it in my own children. They grew up in a community that is propped up by the cannabis industry. And guess what? All of these kids think it's just a normal thing. And that's where we really need to start educating and normalizing these substances.
Yeah, totally. I wonder about how the best way forward is. I know Transform Drug Policy is doing a lot of really great work. I'm really stoked on Portugal generally. It's just what is my catchphrase I'm trying to brand myself with. My job isn't over until I'm buying LSD at Walmart. Without a prescription. So like, pretty aggressive, but it's just a way to illustrate my kind of orientation here.
Well, I just saw another statistic today that after looking at longitudinal data of the last 35 years of emergency room visits, LSD and psilocybin visits made up for 0.05% of all visits, drug overdose style, to the emergency room. So wow. the abuse profile for these drugs are not really there. And the truth of that science has been hidden for many years. And I'm just really excited that it's starting to get back out there. I mean, you talk about taking, it in the wrong set and setting. You have a challenging experience. You're not rushing to take that substance the next day, the next week, the next month. Probably not even for the next year. So, I do think we need to do a better job of educating that there is a low addiction profile to these, very low, and even mortality. People don't die from taking LSD or psilocybin in large doses.
Yeah. And I guess further, not only a better job at education, but we also have to be really careful around how much our government is spending on misinformation, which is certainly a thing that's happening here in the United States. So it's a big deal. All right, let's jump into microdosing. When can you remember when you first found out about microdosing?
Yeah, it was about 3.5, 4 years ago, and I was going through the reality of my cannabis company's newly licensed having little to no value, and realizing that it was time for me to get out of the cannabis space and move on. I began to see the research that Johns Hopkins was doing with large dose psilocybin and depression. I was suffering from depression, felt like I have suffered from depression for more than 39 years at the time, and I began to self dose myself, self treat myself with small amounts of psilocybin. From there, I began to find videos on Jim Fadiman on YouTube, and I began to just listen to anything I could find him or Paul Stamets talking about as far as microdosing. What was amazing is I saw immediate effects from day one.
Mm-hmm.
And
when was this again? Sorry.
This is about 3.5 years ago.
Right on.
So from day one, I saw major effects. I saw that my constantly ruminating negative thoughts, that victim story, everything that I was replaying over and over again was quieted, almost like it was blocked or stunted. I was feeling more creative, more energized, exercising more. So I realized that something was really happening from these sub-hallucinatory doses. Now, again, I had worked with cannabis for a decade. Cannabis up till that point was my tool or my medicine. I felt like it was the best thing on the planet for depression. But what I learned when I started microdosing psilocybin was that the cannabis was really just a band-aid over the wound. It was great for palliative care. It was great for me to, get through certain things, but it wasn't necessarily diving into the wound and doing the healing that I needed. Well, what I found with microdosing psilocybin is I was able to dive into the wound, begin to do that healing, and most importantly for me at the time, smoking way less cannabis, which is something that a lifetime of smoking cannabis I never thought I would be able to reduce. So I saw energy improvements within the first few days. I saw mood improvements. I saw less of a crutch or an addiction or a need to smoking cannabis. And I just began to take myself on a month or two experiment to see how it worked.
And were you doing kind of small sessions and big sessions? Would you ever do eyes closed stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was doing large dose about once every 3 months, and it was 4 to 5 grams, silent darkness, eye mask, or a playlist. It was kind of that McKenna-driven heroic dose. But I was also asking the mushrooms for guidance and intention. And funny enough, it was in one of these large dose ceremonies where the mushrooms told me to seek out Jim Fadiman. And they said, you need to find Dr. Fadiman. You need to tell him what you're doing. By that point, I had about 50 to 60 clients that I was working with that were using microdosing to treat everything from autism to TBI. I had about 5 or 6 professional athletes in the NHL that were using it and seeing great results. So the mushrooms, essentially in a large dose journey, told me to go find Jim and tell him what I was doing. And from there, he became a dear friend and a mentor and a colleague, and he's an advisor to Flow State and myself. And that's kind of where the whole process has started. And from 50 clients, I'm now into a few hundred and having great success with guiding people into finding safe and effective ways to use microdosing.
That's super cool. Did you have a coaching background at all before?
Yeah, I have an education background actually as well. I went back to school after my film degree to be a teacher. I spent a few years as a high school teacher, middle school, elementary as well, taught on all levels, was also a high ropes course facilitator, wilderness guide. So I've done a lot of coaching and guiding athletic coaches as well. So yeah, this is something I've done as far as educating and coaching people for, more than 20 years.
Love it. That's cool. And how, could you give us like a genericized example of like success with let's go with maybe a depressed person and then maybe an athlete?
Yeah, so let's start with the depressed person, and I'll start with myself and eventually a lot of the people that I work with. With depression, people are a lot of times lacking excitement, lacking that feeling of creativity, that inability to get out of that default mode network or that ruminating negative thoughts. What I realized is you actually become addicted to the misery. You become addicted to that negative thinking and the feelings that come from it. Or maybe that's what the mushrooms help to show me. And so over time, what I found is um, oh, I totally got sidetracked. What was I just talking about?
We're talking about the depressed people,
Oh,
how
right.
depression's kind of a
So
habit
you
or something.
Thank you. So you get totally addicted to the cycling of negative thoughts, right? And it becomes like a snowball rolling downhill, getting bigger, more powerful with momentum. And so what I found the microdosing did was it again blocked that default mode network and it gave me a break from that consistent victimization, that victim thinking, that negative thinking. But I was also stacking my psilocybin with lion's mane, which I learned from Paul Stamets. And I also feel like together they were also creating neurogenesis, which is what's making people feel more creative, right? Neurogenesis is the growth of new neural pathways in the brain. We've seen this in studies they've done on mice and rats. We haven't obviously done this in humans yet, so it's a hypothesis or a theory. But I began to feel more creative. I began to feel more energized. Like Dr. Fadiman says on many of his talks, people report that they can do one more rep at the gym. I found that my personal records at the gym got better. I was taking time off my mile. I was scoring 6 or 7 games in pickup soccer, or 6 or 7 goals in pickup soccer instead of 1 or 2. So I definitely could see there was a next level of not only human optimization, but brain optimization, where that addiction to negative thoughts was blocked or stopped. And over time, with good patterns like exercise and reading and meditation and breath work stacked with that microdosing, you're able to somewhat rewire those negative thought patterns into more positive thinking patterns.
I like that a lot. That's pretty cool. And yeah, you're right. The we do have to be careful when we talk about neurogenesis. I feel we trigger a lot of people in the university setting, but it is a really interesting and important topic. I've heard some fun new terms getting tossed around, like neuroplastogen and things like this, and it's pretty exciting to know that language around this stuff is even evolving, right?
Well, what I think is pretty groundbreaking for microdosing is whether I'm working with somebody who has traumatic brain injury and they see huge improvements in reduction of migraines and head pain and ability to put speech patterns, or I'm dealing with somebody with autism, or somebody that I dealt with a few weeks ago, 30 years of eczema cleared up in 2 or 3 days of microdosing. There's something that's happening with these adaptogenic mushrooms. I don't know what it is. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. Again, we can't do post-mortem studies on human brains right now, so we're limited to rat and mice. But I do definitely think something really positive is happening with these mushrooms in small doses and the brain. And Fadiman is quick to point out that there's just as many neural pathways, if not more, in the gut. So it's probably a combination of the gut and the brain.
The gut brain axis. Maybe that's a term. I don't know, but it's something we do need to look at. I was heartened when Stamets started talking recently about this kind of nausea from cubensis mushrooms and sometimes LSD, being possibly from your gut being tickled because there's so many receptor sites there. And I regularly get nausea. It's probably stacked with all my excitement. But yeah, it's funny. It's like what is this, and why is it that some things don't trigger it and some things do? It's fascinating. Like some of that mushroom goo, zero nausea. LSD, cubensis mushrooms, sometimes nausea. So it's fascinating, and people do need to check that out. And I'm not talking about microdoses. People, microdoses. I've never felt anything in my gut. Um, yeah. So I guess let's kind of define microdose. Do you have like a good functional definition of microdosing generally?
Yeah, so it would be 1/10 to 1/20th of a normal dose of a substance. Today, we're obviously talking about a psychedelic. So, A normal dose of LSD, let's say, would be 100 micrograms. So a microdose would be 1/10 of that. 10 micrograms would be a good place to start. I think what's important are the descriptive words. For many years, Dr. Fadiman described it as subperceptual. He's not really using that word anymore because there are people who definitely notice some perceptual effects. So I've more recently heard Paul Stamets use the word subsensorium, which I think is another great descriptive word, which is kind of under the sensation of you noticing that you've taken something. I think my personal favorite word, though, is subhallucinatory, and the idea that there are no classic psychedelic effects. You may go out throughout your day and notice that you haven't taken anything, or you may notice a slight uplift in energy or thoughts or something like that. But again, it's no classic psychedelic effects. It's subhallucinatory. And then it's really just a debate over whether a word like subperceptual or subsensorium works. What we really want to define, though, is what a mini dose is. And a mini dose is when you start to have those perceptual feelings like you're coming on, you've taken a psychedelic, oh boy, those type things. And those are definitely not a microdose. So you may go through your day on a microdose not noticing much, and you may notice certain slight things. So we like to say subhallucinatory might be the best descriptive word in my personal opinion.
Kyle and I recorded with Jim Fadiman a few months back, and he did reframe it for me, and it sounds spot on. So you've clearly been talking to him, but it was something along the lines of, you just don't get the sense that you're high, but you might notice something. It's like,
well, the tricky part is, and that's where the education and the harm reduction comes in with microdosing, is one dose doesn't work the same for everyone. And that's the aspect of teaching sweet spot and finding your sweet spot. What is your dose that keeps it subhallucinatory? For me, it's 90 to 100 milligrams. But I've met with clients that are super, super sensitive, and grown men who 25 milligrams begins to be hallucinatory. So you just have to realize that you really have to be a citizen scientist when you're exploring these things. You have to have a journal.
Fascinating. Quarter gram or 25 milligrams.
25 milligrams, right? And this is a gentleman that is well over 225 pounds. So the whole idea of kilogram to dosage doesn't really make sense there. And then I've also met people who've been on medications for 20 years, and they'll eat 3 grams of psilocybin and have zero effects. So there's so much research that needs to be done with drug interactions, contraindications, certain things. We just don't have all the answers quite yet.
I remember the famous chemist, Dr. David Nichols, saying something along the lines of psychedelics are not dose dependent, something like that. And spot on for what we're discussing here. I've seen people have very difficult experiences on a gram or less. And I've seen some people on 14 grams you can have a normal conversation with, and it's really, really bizarre. But there's something going on that we need to understand better. So kind of being like universalizing around the prescription of these kind of tryptamines, it's a little iffy. I haven't really dug into this with other categories of molecules. Generally, I put LSD in the tryptamine category. I know it's a little different, but some also a little bit similar. But I don't know. It's a fascinating topic. We forgot to talk about the athletes. So results for somebody with TBI and or a high performance person. What have you got?
Yeah, so currently there's 6 NHL guys I'm working that are playing actively in the NHL right now and seeing major results. And these are major results not only in performance on the ice, but in training. They're seeing the next level in their training. Here's the best part. They're having less brain fog. They're feeling like these concussions and these repeated injuries they've literally had since they were 7 or 8 are finally being dealt with. And they're almost taking a daily brain vitamin. So the hockey players, to be honest with you, the first sport that's really going to come out with this is hockey and MMA. Those are the 2 guys that I see the most in this line of work. The MMA fighters are seeing the ability to sense microaggressions split seconds before the person even throws a punch or a kick. I've had that verified by multiple professional MMA guys. The NHL guys lent me to a retired professional hockey player who suffered a TBI from a fight where he fell back, he hit his head, he was paralyzed. He microdosed for 2 months to the point where he didn't need to microdose anymore. He was no longer dealing with horrible migraines. He was able to learn to talk again. And within a year, he was engaged and fully employed from a place where he was in bed learning to walk or talk again. And these microdoses were a huge advantage to him. And he's actually somebody who put together a 4 or 5 page letter that we've delivered to Dr. Fadiman, including all of his medical records, the fMRI scans before and after. So we've got all of this recorded by this hockey player. And it's pretty amazing because, as Dr. Fadiman says, there's nothing right now for people with traumatic brain injury. We don't have treatments for you. You hit your brain too hard, and we can only just help you day to day. But personally, this is a theory. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist, but I do think that these mushrooms can rebuild brain, help healing, improve neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, and that's why I think these hockey players and these mixed martial artists that suffer from concussive activity on a daily basis are seeing great benefit.
Yeah, that's really neat. And we've heard a lot of similar things out there because we pay attention, we hear a lot, and there's a lot of really interesting stories about people healing from pretty substantial brain trauma. I've got a number of friends that I wish would get their act together around healing their brains, but fear.
Funny enough, brain trauma is the biggest in extreme sports and snowboarding and skiing. I think of like Kevin Pierce and that documentary Crash Reel and how devastating his concussion was. And I just really see this as the future for these athletes. Like, everybody's into nootropics right now. Everybody's into biohacking and how can I get a slight advantage? Well, the original biohack were the mushrooms. All right. We came from mushrooms millions of years ago, right? So it's not surprising to me that after all of these years of the powers that be somewhat suppressing the knowledge on these plant medicines, that they're finally coming to fruition now when we truly need them the most.
Have you read Dr. Dan Engel's Concussion Repair Manual?
I have not.
It's worth checking out. I live in a concussion city, right? Like we've got plenty. And all my friends, including me, have probably had, at least 5 healthy ones. I think I had three mediums last winter. No treatment whatsoever. I should have paid attention to what Dr. Dan Engel said in his book and, followed these protocols. But of course I didn't. One of the fun ones is cannabis right away. So you knock the shit out of your head and you smoke a joint or something or have a bunch of CBD. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, but there's all sorts of protocols there, but he does include psychedelics in the book because he's part of this psychedelic scene. So he's a helpful ally there. I'm trying to think if there's something else. Have you heard any rumors of sports groups trying to add psychedelics to like the PED list, performance enhancing drug list? Because I find that a fascinating concept.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is most people don't know is none of these leagues, USADA, even the Olympic testing, none of the professional leagues right now are doing any kind of drug screening or panels for psilocybin or LSD. Will that change? It's possible. I mean, here's the reality of what's going on. Way more professional athletes are microdosing right now than can talk about it. My clients can't come out and talk about it or they'll lose their job, right? But they're seeing competitive advantages. So they're doing it and they're telling their friends. Now, Stamets talks about Silicon Valley, the same thing happening, where the firms that microdose together have a competitive advantage over the firms that are not. So I do see in the next 1 to 3 years, as this becomes seen as more performance enhancing in pro leagues, that USADA and the NHL and all these leagues will have to address it. Now, here's the tricky part of it. How are they going to address it if it's also healing their players' brains? And if it's also supporting, their recovery. And I think that that's where the professional leagues are lacking, is once their players retire and they're not making money for the leagues anymore, they forget about them. And part of what I want to do with Flow State Micro and the athletes I work with when they retire is we want to start an institute that helps these athletes post-retirement to heal their brain with psychedelics. And I'm hoping that one day the NHL sponsors that, NFL sponsors that, MLB sponsors that. We're not there yet, but the athletes are seeing the changes and they're speaking out.
Right. Like we are in this really weird time with sports where it seems like American football is not going to be what it is today in a few years. And including, even like soccer is going to change a ton. I think one of the classic and worst hit CTE groups, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, if I'm not mistaken, is female soccer players. Female professional soccer players somehow have worse CTE than men, which is definitely something to consider. Like what's going on there? Is there a structural difference? Is there a hormone reaction difference? So, we're not just talking about male athletes, but, female athletes might even have it worse. So big topic, and it works for all of us. So, yeah. And how does this change what like high school sports looks like? Right. Like I don't want to say we're selling high school kids mushrooms or anything, but like, what is that? How do we do our heritage, our sports without, hurting these people for the rest of their lives?
Well, you bring me to a good point, which is we have an ancestral and evolutionary connection to these plants, right? And it's only in the last couple hundred years that they've been made illegal and bastardized and looked at poorly. I recently had the opportunity to interview a Mazatec elder about the roots of microdosing. And I talk about this in the course with San Francisco Psychedelic Society. And basically, the elder shared with me that this is something they've been doing, since the beginning of time. And the Mazatec tradition is an oral tradition. It's not written down. So it's shared orally. And this person has verified that with the elders. Not only that, she confirmed two really important things to me I want to share with your viewers. One is that pregnant women should not microdose psilocybin or use psilocybin in any way, shape, or form. And that within the Mazatec community, they had seen that psilocybin can cause uterine contractions that could lead to miscarriage. So one of the most important things I learned is big no-no for any pregnant woman to microdose psilocybin. The other thing she told me is, as long as they've known, they've given babies small amounts of mushrooms in a bottle with breast milk to ease things like colic and upset stomach. So if you were born in an indigenous community, or we went back in time thousands of years ago, your mom wouldn't think twice about putting a pinch of mushrooms in your milk bottle. It's just recently that we've turned a mushroom into something that's illegal. So I do have hope for high school kids. I mean, Albert Hoffman was saying that microdosing would have replaced Adderall and Ritalin. We're putting 5 or 6-year-old kids on Adderall, which is methamphetamine, but we're pointing fingers at a parent who gives their kid 10 milligrams of a mushroom. So I think we need to better educate people that we have a evolutionary connection to mushrooms. As I was saying to you earlier, 22 primates, 23, including ourselves, eat mushrooms.
I love that figure. It's so interesting. I love this. It's like kind of mycocentric, so I appreciate this because it gives us room to kind of go back and forth. So like I know in a lot of peyote traditions, the huichol, they would eat while pregnant. I know in ayahuasca circle and feed babies peyote. The ones who liked it, they might be able to tell, would be shamans in the future. Tryptamine, phenethylamine, very different compounds. That's it. And there's also kind of small dose ayahuasca use in some Brazilian tribes and modern religions. Also of note, Dr. Stan Groff lists pregnancy as a contraindication to holotropic breath work, talking about the extreme stage could theoretically precipitate early contractions as well. So it's kind of like validation with a modern person and validating kind of indigenous wisdom there. So, I would want to triangulate a little bit more before I'm super prescriptive. But we did a bunch of work on this. It's a really interesting topic. I feel bad sometimes for my pregnant friends that they can't hang, but that's kind of part of the jam being pregnant.
That is part of being pregnant, and I like to say that being a parent and eating psychedelics is only something you can understand unless you've done it firsthand. You can't explain to somebody what drinking ayahuasca is like. You can't explain to somebody what watching your child be born into the world is like, or being up every night on 2 hours of sleep for the first 3 months like that. You can't explain that. You have to experience that. And, you mentioned peyote, and one of the other things we discuss in the class, and something else I found in the research for my new book, is that Cortés learned about the use of microdosing peyote when he was conquering the Aztecs. And he realized it had stimulant-like effects for his troops. So I found actual references in literature that says that Cortés would microdose his troops with peyote to help them be able to hike long distances in their heavy steel armor. And that's another thing you'll learn in our online course. Is part of what made the Spanish conquest so successful is they had steel armor and cannons and guns and arrows, whereas the Aztecs didn't have any of that hardcore weaponry. So the Spanish were the ones that drove mushroom use and plant use underground from 1520s till Marie Sabina in 1953. So the funny thing is, when they found a use for it, which is making our troops march longer distances, they sure gave it to themselves. So that just goes to show you that, the people that drove it underground knew it had positive benefits for people.
Two things. I would love for you to write something for us about Cortés microdosing soldiers. Number two, did you ever bump into any literature about the Catholic Church or the Pope giving kind of edicts around, hey, Spanish conquistadors, like, do this, please, and make sure you shut them up?
Yeah, so there's some great books out there. One is Broken Spears. Fifth Son is another great one, an up-to-date Aztec version of their account of things. And what I teach in the class is really clear that, like, the history is written by the victors. And the first orders from the church were to destroy everything. Destroy all the mushroom effigies, destroy all the temples, destroy all their written works. They wanted to erase their history and their culture. And that is effectively what they did. And yet they still saw benefit, and they still used it. So, and as far as the church goes, I found some other very fascinating information about Wasson and the church. R. Gordan Wasson, the CIA MKUltra informant who went down and tricked Sabina into giving him mushrooms by saying his son was kidnapped. Well, Wasson, it turns out, was found out years later, was the personal banker for the Vatican. He handled all of the Pope and the Vatican's money. Now, at the end of his career, Wasson made the claim that all religions in history came from spiritual experiences based off of mushrooms or psychedelics, except Christianity. And Wasson went after John D. Allegro, who wrote The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and ruined his career, all because he was trying to protect the Vatican as their private banker. So that's another thing that I talk about in detail in episode 2 is the truth behind R. Gordan Wasson, his connection to Sidney Gottlieb, Alan Dulles, MKUltra, and essentially how he became popular, and Sabina was chased out of her village, her son was murdered, and she died in poverty.
Yeah, smiley stuff. It's good. And it's important. I've been trying to dig into this this story around the church, because we'll say it's the English's fault or the Spanish's fault, and it's like for a time they were reporting up the chain a little bit and following certain kinds of orders, why wouldn't they want a spiritual monopoly? Of course they did. And yeah, like remember Terence McKenna doing a lot of stuff on priestcraft in a lot of his talks, saying like this stuff was pretty democratic for a while, and then all of a sudden the priests wanted more and more power and kind of said, no, no more sacrament for you, no more active sacrament for you, passive maybe. And it's an interesting talk track. So yeah, there's a lot of suppressed history. There's a lot of violence, and there's a lot of secret history that's probably only existing in the Vatican archives in written form at this point. So there's a lot of history to do. Brian Murarescu had access to the archives. He's still Catholic, so I don't think he's got a chip on his shoulder like I do. But there's a lot of historical work to do on this.
But I think Brian's work and his ability to get DNA analysis of the goblets and finally prove that there was an ergot-based substance in some of these goblets really started off this need for us to really go back and do the research. And one of the books that I've really enjoyed recently is The Psychedelic Gospels by Jerry and Julie Brown. And this is basically...
We're releasing a class with them really soon, by the way, or with Jerry.
Yes, well, I highly recommend this book. And actually, it's going to be a new topic of something that I want to start teaching in the future, which is this possibility that, Jesus and the mushroom and Jerry and Julie make amazing case. I mean, they find frescoes from the 1100s where the artists have hidden psilocybin mushrooms in the hems of the disciples' robes at the Last Supper. They've pointed out huge disparities in things on the table like cutting knives that would have been used to cut mushrooms because you broke bread with your hands in those days, not with a knife. And they went on this journey through Europe and they found all these old frescoes with huge mushrooms in them. And basically, when you were making those frescoes back in the day, the world was illiterate. They didn't read. So whatever you painted into a painting was supposed to tell them symbolically what was important in the culture. So these mushrooms were hidden in plain sight. And I'm more excited about talking more about the potential connection between Christianity, Jesus, and mushrooms as well.
I love the line, Jesus was a mushroom. I find that not only comical and kind of like transgressive, but like kind of insightful too.
And I think that was pretty much the thesis of Allegro's argument, was that Jesus wasn't necessarily a person. He was a mushroom. He was the sacred mushroom. And I'm reading that book right now so I can learn more about it. But I mean, who knows? Like I said, the victors write the history. And one thing I learned from the Immortality Key in Brian Murarescu's book is that, there were orders to destroy all of the Eleusinian Mysteries artifacts, scrape the faces off of the altars. I mean, they destroyed everything instantaneously because they wanted control. And, we're still dealing with that same controlling power today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. And it's so ingrained in Western life now on account of how much energy went into the drug war and misinformation itself. And now we have a very large project on our hands of digging ourselves out of this hole. And, it's a lot of work. It's going to be a very large project. I feel like the term decolonizing is not the accurate term for what I'm talking about, but it's like we need to reclaim a lot of autonomy here and understand history, contextualize it appropriately so that we have a way of dealing with this stuff going forward in a healthy, productive direction, and stop putting people in cages for nonviolent offenses around substance. Right? It's
amen. And there is so much history in all of these books, and there was so much research done in the 50s and 60s, and there's so much documentation for hundreds of years of the use of these plant medicines in positive ways and in many communities that, we have to have a right again to know the truth, and we were talking about it earlier. Like, a lot of people think How to Change Your Mind is like the history of psychedelics. And the reality of it is it's just like 1/10 of the history of psychedelics. Even the online course with 6 episodes, the first 3 being about, the evolution of psychedelics, we're just barely tapping in to the history. And, for all your listeners, there's so much history out there in books and online and in podcasts like this that you can find out about and re-educate yourself, because we have a right to access these things in a safe way. They're helpful.
Amen. Yeah. Yeah. There's a bunch of things in Pollen that kind of drove me nuts. Like, he's a consistently anti-Tim Leary, which I was chatting with another Tim Leary fan earlier today, and we were just fawning over how much is there. And it's extraordinary. But he's the taboo. He's the new Satan, right? You can't talk about him in polite company. And I like to bring him up on the podcast regularly as an important figure.
Yeah, so I know that Pollen sat down with Jim Fadiman for a few extensive interviews and got a lot of his info on Al Hubbard. And I know Al Hubbard had a real issue with Tim Leary, and I kind of wonder if maybe some of Hubbard's issue came across in Michael Pollan's writing, potentially. But yeah, there are a lot of people that felt like Leary blew it for what they were doing with the human being, and by saying tune in, turn on, drop out, all that stuff. So maybe Pollan was just keen in on the Hubbard energy. But yeah, Captain Al Hubbard was definitely, not a huge fan of Tim Leary.
Right. And, why would he be? He's like straight up 1950s kind of masculine character, right? Like the classic American in a lot of ways. Though he wasn't even American, right? Was he Canadian?
He had dual citizenship because he was working secretly.
That's right. He was a spooky guy. Wasn't he, like, smuggling uranium and stuff too?
He was a spy. Before the United States entered World War II, Al Hubbard was secretly driving warships with his wife. Imagine these massive warships, 2 people, and he would drive them from Southern California to Vancouver, where they would retrofit them, make them look like Canadian warships, and then they would go and fight the Germans. But he also flew planes to the Canadian border, took them apart, towed them into Canada, put them back together. He was a huge double informant. He worked for the OSS during the World Wars, and the CIA numerous times tried to get him to be a part of it. But he loved LSD so much for its mystical potential that he never could get down with the fact that they were using it for murder and torture.
There's a line in one of your videos you sent me from the class, like, even though they're killing all these people, they still can't do it right, or something crazy like that, talking about the agency. And it's really fascinating. Yeah. The fact that he was OSS and refused to join up and do more CIA stuff is really interesting. Yeah. There needs to be a movie about Hubbard for sure.
Absolutely. There absolutely does need to be a movie about Hubbard. And the word on the streets was that the CIA owed him a large amount of money from the operations he was doing with the OSS, and they never paid him. So he was pretty pissed off from that, was supposedly the story. But I do think, along with Leary, that Al Hubbard does deserve to get mentioned and talked about, which is why we spend so much time talking about him in the class, is because, he is really the originator of set and setting. He came up with that before Hubbard. He came up with the Hubbard room, the idea of getting it out of the clinical trials and into a dimly lit room with furniture that's comfortable. And so he does deserve a lot of credit for that. But yeah, he was a spy. He was a double agent. But he was also the person that spent millions of dollars turning on the Hollywood celebrities, and would fly Cary Grant and many, many famous celebrities in his private jet from LA to an island he had in Vancouver, where he would lead them through LSD ceremonies. And, even this day, I was talking to Jim Fadiman the other day, and he reminded me one more time, Al Hubbard was the best LSD guide on the planet. And Hubbard taught Fadiman, taught, a bunch of the people that were working with him at IFAS in Silicon Valley. So Hubbard was like the original LSD guide.
Yeah. I think you said Johnny Appleseed of LSD in the video, and I think that's spot on. He turned so many people on. He changed, democratized it so much that it became uncontrollable, in part because of that. If we believe the popular narratives, I guess. It's such a confusing topic because there's so much misinformation, disinformation out there, that the history is difficult. This is not a straightforward story. If you read anything in a book, you have to triple verify from others And to bring some more Tim Leary back, think for yourself and question authority here when you're reading history, because there is some bullshit. Just because it's on paper doesn't make it true.
Yeah, and a lot of the stuff that's been figured out about MKUltra and their projects they found it through accounting records. So basically, I think it was Sidney Gottlieb or Alan Dulles, when they retired, they burned all the files. And the only way that they could prove that it existed to start with the investigation was they found accounting, and they found payments from the CIA in accounting records that they forgot to burn. And then from there, the truth came out of it. What's not talked about is the fact that after Hoffman developed LSD, that the CIA went there and they bought the entire world supply of LSD, partially
like
because
large 50-gallon drums, right, of LSD.
they spent $240,000 at that time, which would have been millions of dollars, to buy up all the LSD, because they were afraid the Russians would beat them to it. And they were afraid that it would be the truth serum. And yet, what did they do? They brought it back to the United States. They set up all these shell corporations to do all of these research trials in hospitals and prisons and universities. And then they turned on the psychedelic movement. They gave it to Ken Kesey. They gave it to Robert Hunter, who was the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, who then went and told Jerry about it. So it was the CIA that actually started the whole LSD movement and supplied the country with it until Owsley Stanley and others figured out how to compete with that Sandoz LSD.
I want to go down this rabbit hole so bad, but last kind of scary thing. Have you read Chaos yet?
No.
Worth it, 100%. It's extraordinary. I can't wait to get the guy on the show. He kind of dug deep on this kind of creepy talk track around Manson, LSD, and found a lot of really interesting involvement from surprising people. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. So have you been able to kind of work some people through your microdosing course yet? Have you had any kind of early results from students?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of great feedback from students. We've had people watching it so closely that they've corrected me on which President Roosevelt that I said. I mean, we've got people fact checking it, making sure that everything's right. And we're getting a lot of great feedback. People are loving it. To date, we've only released the first 3 episodes. Episode 4 comes out tomorrow, I believe. So people they're enjoying it. For a lot of people, this is the first time that they're hearing the idea of microdosing could have started in the stoned ape theory times, right? That the whole idea of our beginnings in microdosing started as we were tracking game. We were eating large doses, but those large doses weren't very good for hunting. At some point, we ate a small dose and we realized, much like Cortés, that it had a stimulant-like effect and that we could chase that animal longer. We could track down that game and our tribe would be more successful. So people have been really enjoying it. And, obviously it's a theory. It's a hypothesis. It's not something that we're going to ever be able to prove. But we're just hoping that people will start to realize that microdosing is not something that was invented in 2013 with Jim Fadiman's Psychedelic Explorer. And that, in fact, I've been able to trace microdosing back through thousands of years in Mexico, in Europe, and, back potentially to the stoned ape and when we're coming out of the canopy. So if people realize that this is something we've been doing that's helping us evolve, Paul Stamets believes that it's going to help us to become more creative, to solve the problems that are plaguing the world right now. And I believe in that too, because I've seen how it adds to my creativity and I've seen how it helps to kind of mute that depressive side of me that I'm so used to hearing.
I guess to add a little, there's good evidence for microdosing in the Bwiti traditions around Ibogaine. There's all sorts of use cases around this. And I'm sure European witches that you kind of comment on in some of your videos were doing some microdosing with some psychoactives. I think somebody needs to do a lot of work there. I think Tom Hatzis has done some, but I would love for some more people to get involved in that. Because, us people of European descent, like we probably should understand what our people were up to as well. As opposed to ignoring it and grabbing onto somebody else's, right? Exactly. And we had psilocybin containing plants in Europe or mushrooms in Europe. So maybe. Um, yeah, and I'm not telling anybody to go out and drink some henbane potion tonight or anything. Like, I, in fact, might discourage you from doing that. But there was some kind of wild, spooky psychoactives in those worlds, and I think some of those traditions are still alive. I bet in like Romania, kind of Transylvania, where the empire didn't get a perfect stranglehold, there's still some living, continuous traditions there. Um, to be investigated. Yeah. If it's compatible with our worldview at this point is quite questionable, but who knows?
Well, you reminded me of the Tarahumara Indians, which are a group in northern Mexico that have been unchanged since pre-Columbian times. They have not changed their ways. They're also they're super famous for being insane long distance runners. They run over 100 miles at a time with these little sandals that are like this thin, and they're like a leather lace. They are incredible endurance runners, and one of their secrets is they take microdoses of peyote. And the only thing that they're running in besides their sandals is their outfit with a little sash that has the peyote in it. So these people have used peyote for thousands of years because it helps them run long distances. The original purpose of them running long distances was, again, tracking game, right? You wound a piece of game and it runs for, 20 miles. Are you going to be able to track it down? This tribe figured out that using peyote gave them a next level, and they're still using it today. Funny enough, this tribe's most important tenet is nonviolence, and somehow they've been able to keep their homeland free of loggers and narcos and all kinds of crazy stuff. And it's all on this tenet of nonviolence. So check out the Tarahumara Indians of northern Mexico as well.
That's extraordinary. I think I had some sort of fantasy around this in my mind growing up. This ultra running kind of, Mexico and South kind of tribes having this near magical ability to just run. And, this is probably something I heard in my mind, my middle school mind. It was Inca on the Andes, but, why not elsewhere too? Yeah. And I would love for us to know more about what traditions were active in China and India. Like, we've got plenty on Soma, but we still kind of stuck there. But why not do more serious research to find out what was going on there? Like, perhaps the issue is we have peyote and cubensis, and it's obvious the use cases now. So it's kind of like hard to do a little bit of digging to find out what was going on there.
Yeah, and interesting enough about the Soma, I heard an interview one time with Ram Dass, a really rare interview, and I had never heard Maharaji or Neem Karoli Baba. I never heard him address the Soma. But in this interview, Ram Dass basically says that one time he had a conversation with Neem Karoli Baba, and Neem Karoli said, yes, the Soma is real. It's happened for thousands of years, but its ways and traditions have been forgotten. Basically, you had to do years of fasting. You had to do all these certain things to be able to take in the Soma. But basically, Baba said it's been forgotten. The austerities and what's needed to be done to do it properly was forgotten. But he definitely validated that there's been use of Soma for thousands of years. And I thought that'd be good to share because not a lot of people have seen that interview.
Mike Crowley's Secret Drugs of Buddhism is really interesting in this regard. He talks a lot about kind of different psychoactives that are used in various Tibetan or Buddhist traditions generally. Also, Chris Bennett and Mike Crowley have a lot of back and forth battling on the history and authenticity. But Mike Crowley being a kind of insider, not a scholar in the sense we might want to think about it, but he's an active person in those groups. So he's had these things and knows a lot about that. We think of Buddhism as one thing, but it's probably thousands of things, thousands of small little cults. And same with Hinduism, like small little fractured groups doing their own jam. And maybe imperialism kind of shut it down and made it quiet.
Yeah, I mean, what I think so fascinating is just that connection that shamanism led to religion, or that idea that early shamanism is what early shamanism and the use of plant medicine and these psychedelic substances is what led to the visions of deity and gods and eventually all of these religions. You know, these are theories I've heard. I think it was Richard Evans Schultes was maybe the first to kind of throw that idea out there that shamanism in indigenous cultures early on led to what is religion as we see it nowadays. And I think as somebody who's taken large doses and connected with source and the infinite spirit and been taught the infinite lessons like you're never born and you never die, really realizes that these type of things exist and it's real.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's fun. I'm reminded of Egyptian use. I think you comment on. I think it's more speculated around use in ancient Judaism, but I think there is probably some use there. But I think we need to do a little bit more history to pin that down for sure. Murarescu makes a great case for proto-Christianity, for sure. I find that argument really fascinating and compelling, especially with kind of the diaspora of the Eleusinian mysteries. And just endless history left to do, endless work left to do. And, you don't actually need to do the history in its entirety to get the benefit of microdosing, right?
Yeah, and in class 1, I talk about the cave paintings and the ancient cave paintings, and I think that that's the most glaring reminder to us as to how important these mushrooms were to early man. Was if you go to Algiers in northern Africa, 9000 BCE, there's cave paintings of mushroom shamans and mushroom dancers running around with mushrooms. And then you go to 6500 BCE and you go to Spain, and there is cave drawings of mushrooms that mushroom experts in modern times have verified are the mushroom variety next to cows, right? It's that sacred relationship of cows, their dung, these mushrooms. And that's what I just try to get across to people is it's like, look, if you're scratching something on a cave wall, it's got to be the most important thing in your society or one of the most important things, right? And we've proven from dating these both that basically at the same time in Africa and Spain, the tribes are eating mushrooms. And I just think that that's something that more people need to realize. And what's really cool is the U.S. Forest Service actually acknowledges that one of these cave paintings is the oldest known petroglyph of a psilocybin-based mushroom.
That's really friggin' cool. Wow. Yeah, it's a really compelling argument. This kind of long-standing use. It feels like we have to work so hard to make these arguments because we're getting better data on microdosing. There's going to be so many great studies coming out soon. Like you mentioned, this particular 2013 UCSF study on kind of fear extinction from epigenetic kind of fear and extinction through psilocybin or microdoses, and it's extraordinary. And wait till we see it in humans. But I guess one of the biggest counterpoints, like when I think about cubensis or LSD microdosing, I think like it's wildly safe. I look at the 2009 Lancet David Nutt study on drug harm scale, LSD, psilocybin being the lowest on the scale, and that alone being a pretty good indicator of safety for me. It's a good enough argument for me. But what are we hesitant around? Like, what's the scary part around microdosing and the fear? And what some people come up with, and I feel like Amanda Fielding at MAPS 2019 or 2017, I forget when I was there and she was there, but she was talking about this exact topic. What is it? 5-HT2B, binding activity and a elongation or some sort of modification to heart valves, and drawing a correlation to what was happening to a lot of athletes under the influence of fen-phen. So heart attacks were happening, heart changes were substantial, but we're dealing with like massive doses of fen-phen, and we're dealing with milligrams or micrograms of psilocybin or LSD. So it's like, how can we even equate this? And wouldn't we have data? Like, aren't researchers checking this out? Or is there not enough funding to check out something like this? I don't know. Like, have you dug into this topic much?
Yeah, actually, this is a question that gets asked to Jim Fadiman a lot, and the question of can this be bad for your heart, or can microdosing lead to a heart attack, or if I have heart issues, do I have to worry about that? And the first thing I'd say is, I'm not a medical doctor. Jim Fadiman's not a medical doctor. He's a PhD. Remember that. And just realize that we don't have the answer as to how you specifically are going to work with any medication, which is why we're being specific that education is the most important thing, and we need to be clear about it. What Dr. Fadiman, what Jim says is there's very, very, very little concern for heart issues or anything like that having to do with subsensorium doses of psilocybin or LSD. I don't remember the details, but there's some real flaws to that study that you even mentioned, and certain studies they've done with LSD and psilocybin. So what I would say is from the more than
The
2,000.
David Nutt study.
Yeah. Well, I shouldn't say there's flaws in anything. I shouldn't say that. But what I should say is from thousands of citizen scientists that he's heard from directly, from hundreds of clients I've worked with directly, and from tens of thousands of people sharing on Reddit, we see zero, if any, reports of heart issues. So with that, I'm saying if you have a heart issue, don't microdose. You shouldn't microdose. What are you doing? Like, don't. Why take the risk?
Maybe let's differentiate between chronic microdosing and like intermittent as well, because the fear from these people is chronic, like daily, if not every other day or something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, let's be really specific about what we're talking about too.
So
Like,
the really cool part about microdosing as opposed to pharmaceutical medications is it has a 48-hour effect. Psychedelics have an afterglow or a 48-hour effect. So you don't need to microdose 7 days a week. You can take it on a Monday, take Tuesday off, and you're still getting benefits. So what I see over time with microdosing is the more people use it, the less they need it. This isn't a Western medical model of you're going to take microdoses 5 days a week because it regulates your blood pressure and your heart condition. It's not like that. This is more like the more people are microdosing over time, the less they need it. And if you were to microdose 7 days a week, you would build a tolerance within 3 to 4 days and you would lose effectiveness. There were studies done in the 1950s with humans microdosing LSD where they found out that 3 days of LSD in a row, your tolerance is completely built up. And then they also found 3 days off and your tolerance is completely renewed. So tolerance gets built up if you microdose every day. The effectiveness of the tool in itself is lost. You don't want to microdose every day. And I want to be clear that when I'm coaching people or working with clients, the goal is to eventually not microdose. And what I find is people will go from, maybe 4 or 5 days a week in the first month to 2 times a week in the second month to once a month at times, to people just using it as a tool in their arsenal when they're suffering through some really struggling and challenging points in their life. So microdosing is not a 7-day-a-week thing. It's not a rest of your life thing. It's actually something that we see people reduce over time.
right. So Amanda Fielding, when she addressed this, was talking about her own personal use. She was doing pretty high doses daily, effectively, of LSD. I think like 200 micrograms or greater for a long period of time. And as it was part of the culture she was in, as part of the scene. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's just kind of what it was. And she doesn't have a cardiac condition. And I think from, all of the 1960s, like all the people who were at all these Grateful Dead shows and doing a lot of psychedelics for a long period of time, we would have some data. We would have some hint that there's actually something going on. So I'm not really cautious on that, but I understand there's still debate. And I want to respect the debate, but I also want to go, yeah, you guys are being a little too cautious. And it seems like pro-drug war narrative regularly to me, as opposed to stuff's kind of safe. It's not that bad. Let's take a measured approach here.
So I think it's safe. I don't think it's safe to take any substance 7 days a week for the rest of your life. And you brought up Amanda taking 200 mics every day for a
I don't
year.
want to put a word in your mouth, but that's what I remember.
Okay. Well, you reminded me that one of the torture experiments the CIA did was on Whitey Bulger, who was a crime boss, and they gave him large doses of LSD every day for a year in
I've got some
prison.
ties to that guy.
Yeah, and he nearly lost his mind until the day he died. The person he wanted to get after and get revenge against the most was the people that were torturing him with the LSD. So I don't think LSD or mushrooms is something we take 7 days a week for the rest of our lives. There's an afterglow effect to it. I also found a rat study that found that giving rats LSD every other day after a month or two lends to them, kind of being more anxious. They spend less time grooming themselves. They're more erratic. So I don't necessarily think, LSD long-term microdosing is really the thing to do either. It's personally why I believe more in psilocybin microdosing and working with, a natural fungi instead of something that's synthesized and maybe you don't necessarily know what you're getting.
Mm-hmm. Right. Once I'm buying it in Walmart, I'll theoretically know what I'm getting. So improved, progress through Walmart. So we'll see. We'll see.
And you're absolutely right. And you're absolutely right, Joe. There's plenty of people out there that know exactly what they're getting and how to make really great LSD and how to share it with their friends. I'm not knocking anybody, but for beginners out there without the connections, you definitely have to be really careful.
Caution, caution, caution. And there are places to get testing. So you can find places to mail your stuff to and get really great tests done. But yeah, until we end this drug war, safety is a problem. A mushroom looks like a mushroom, so you're probably getting what you want. That said, it's probably best to grow your own, but I don't want to really necessarily encourage breaking the law, though I guess I do that all day long here. But yeah, it's an endlessly complex topic given prohibition and our inability to share information sometimes. Like we've seen a lot of suppression of a lot of our colleagues here in the psychedelic space through social media. Like our friends at Double Blind have been beat up a lot, and it's incredible. Thank the mushroom that I've not been shut down yet, but it's always possible. And yeah, government, let's never forget that there's a lot of folks out there at the federal, state, and local level that would be glad to put you in prison for a few decades if you made the wrong missteps. So, there is risk here beyond just pharmacology and interactions. So be careful when you're operating out there.
And you reminded me of that new statistic that just came out, which is fentanyl deaths is higher than COVID, heart disease, and the top 3 other deaths put together right now. And nobody's talking about fentanyl. Fentanyl killed my cousin 15 years ago when it was the brand new drug to cut heroin. And today, 15 years later, we've done nothing. And it's the leading cause of death between 25 and 45 is fentanyl overdose. So there's
the new crack. It's been treated like this hype monster. So we have to understand that you don't necessarily need a hazmat suit. Carry naloxone if you're in the drug culture. You're going to be around drug users. Never use alone. Get training. Try to test. There's fentanyl test strips that cost $2 now. $2. I've had fentanyl maybe 5, 6 times. Supervised administration through talented anesthesiologists, but like the fact that it can kill somebody with a few grains of the substance is tragic, and it happens all the time. There was LSD blotter being sold in Canada a number of years ago that was actually fentanyl, no LSD whatsoever, and it was on blotter paper. There's very few drugs that you can transmit on paper. This was one of them, so that's probably why they were doing it. Maybe the penalty was lesser if it looked like acid. But yeah, like we need to work towards safe supply. This is a big portion of my argument, Adam, around decrim not necessarily being good enough. But it is a step in the right direction because it allows for safety. The fact that we have to work so hard to be able to offer testing to our peers It's
Yep.
unbelievable and very unethical.
I think it allows for safety, and then I think also if psychedelics ever does go legal, which it may, the decrim also allows small communities to grow, gift, and gather, and take care of themselves, and not be arrested if they choose not to buy the expensive legal product. And I do think it's a good step, and I think that if we could have done cannabis differently in California, they would have decriminalized it first and not done what they did. But we can't go back in time, so I'm hoping that it's a good first step. It's not the final step, as you say, but if we could start getting it decriminalized state to state, I think that's really, really a big step for us.
Mm, yeah. And do you have any opinion on like kind of how aggressive sometimes decrim nature is around like possession limits or anything like this? Or do you have a particular orientation around the decrim project?
I don't. I want to be careful not to say anything too positive or too negative about any brand. I think what Decrim Nature is doing good is allowing people to know that these are parts of nature that were criminalized, and we have a right to decriminalize them. I don't have the answer on limits. You know, Scott Wiener and his group, they added last minute limits in 519 before they took it off the table. Their whole reason for adding limits, they said, was because no one would accept it without limits. I don't have the answer. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to make it perfectly legal. I don't know how to limit it for one group and not limit it for the other. What I do know is we do need to, give back to the cultures and the communities that have held these things sacred while we were murdering them and imprisoning them, and finding a way to, help people that can't afford $3,000 MDMA treatments, right? Or $5,000 ketamine treatments. Like, we need to make,
A modest price for MDMA treatments.
there you go. Case in point, we need to make these tools that are effective and help people, we need to make them affordable. So I don't have all the answers for that. I learned a lot of tough lessons in cannabis, and the last thing we need to do is use this cannabis model. We need to create an entirely new one, and I don't know what that is.
Hmm. Sounds like something I should dig into more. It's I'm actually moderating a panel with Carlos from Decrim Nature on Saturday, hoping not to get stabbed on account of all the kind of rough pushback I've given Decrim Nature. They've come at me pretty hard in the past, so I'm hoping it's genial. We'll see. And yeah, hopefully we
Well,
can just keep
can I
moving
say
this
this?
thing forward.
Can I say
Go
this?
ahead.
I just want to say this to all the brands out there, all the Decrim Nature, all we're a community, guys. We're not competitors. We're a community, all right? And that's where cannabis went wrong. Is everybody, Jake and Steve and Tom, who came into the space, acted like they were your bro and they were your homie, but they just wanted to use you to steal your IP and kick you to the curb. And we can't let that happen in psychedelics. It's not about competition, okay? We all need to get together and realize there's plenty of room for everybody in this space. And look, let's be honest, people's egos are involved here. Mine's involved, everyone's involved. Let's be realistic. It's not about me or anyone behind any brand or community. It's about getting access back to the people for these plants and fungi that have been a part of our life since our evolution.
Mm, I love it. That's a great message. Yeah, and what are we fighting for? What are we fighting for? And I would add on, I'm trying to get all the political prisoners out of prison as a result of the drug war. But, I understand not every psychedelic person cares about the drug war the same way I do. So, I would hope eventually they understand how nasty it is, and that we need to kind of improve our positioning. But yeah, like spot on. We should understand that we have a lot to share here. And let's be kind to each other so we don't burn bridges for years. I feel like I've wasted time on account of how I've reacted to a lot of this stuff too. I hope everybody learns from this, and hopefully we can all get along. And what are our goals? Like, can we communicate and get our goals together? And I'm a big synthetic person, so it's like complicated when it's about nature. It's like, I gave one of the guys in Denver some shit when they were working on the recent Colorado bill. I'm like, it's okay. I'll give you a pass this time because LSD isn't in there. But, next time around, watch your shit. Kind of hearted. But I'm like, I think the bill from the non-decrim nature side is actually looking really good in Colorado. But, I think it's looking like maybe both bills are going to go in front of the state for the people to vote on in Colorado. Which would be really fascinating.
Well, how incredible is that they get a choice, right? And that is exactly what psychedelics and any space needs, is a choice. There's not one voice for these plants or fungi. These plants and fungi are not only allowed for people that come from certain areas. I mean, these are for the people. And personally, what I've gathered in the large dose experiences I did years back is that they're offering us a lifeline here. They're saying, you guys are about to extinct yourself, and your last hope is eating us and realizing that you are us and that you're extincting yourselves. And if you don't wake up, it's too late. You're gone, and we'll go on without you. And I think these plant medicines and these fungi, they love us. They love us so much that they're offering this lifeline right now, and people are responding. And personally, I think that COVID helped the psychedelic movement, and I'm really grateful for everything that's happened in the last 2 years.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and absolutely, I think this was an interesting catalyst for us. All right, Adam, I think this is a good place to wrap. So we're doing a special URL on your class for psychedelics today, folks, where they get a discount. I'm going to put it on this particular episode's page and our welcome page. But what else do we want to talk about?
Well, that's great. Just check out the course. You're going to throw a link in for the course. It's going to dive into the evolutionary and ancestral use of microdosing. We look at the untold history of psychedelics. We look at the rebirth of microdosing. And then we dive into kind of a masterclass for advanced microdosing. That's with the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. You can find the link for that in the show notes. Again, with the Psychedelics Today, we're offering 10% discount for your listeners if they use that Psychedelics Today link. You can follow me on Flow State Micro on Instagram. And other than that, was just really, really glad to be here with you today. I really appreciate all you and Kyle do, and this podcast, and getting the message out.
Thank you. It's been fun, Adam, and I hope we can do it again. Talking more about the spooky, because you're now kind of a historian in my mind. So glad to have you among the ranks of historians of psychedelics. So let's keep doing it.
Awesome. And you can check me out in Rising Consciousness in Utah, March 9th and 10th. Joe, I hope you make it to Utah. We get a chance to shred and talk in person. And again, just keep doing what you're doing. Thanks for spreading the good word.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Until next time.